what we've accomplished already. We've confirmed a Supreme Court justice. I think, frankly, we're about to confirm another. We've confirmed 24 circuit court judges. No president has ever had this many circuit court judges confirmed this early in a presidency since the creation of the circuit court appellate level back in the 1800s. We've repealed quite a number of regulations, ill-conceived regulations that were problematic for the economy. We passed the biggest tax reform in 37 years, which I think has been very, very constructive. Well, we didn't repeal Obamacare, we made the individual mandate, we repealed the individual mandate, so participation for individuals is now voluntary. We opened up ANWR for development of oil and natural gas in one of the world's richest reserves of energy. And this year, this summer, we are in the process of restoring the ordinary process of funding the government through a series of incremental, discrete funding bills, rather than this disastrous process we've had in most recent years where we wait till the end of the fiscal year, we haven't passed anything, and so we have the threat of a government shutdown, and then these temporary extensions of funding authority to be followed by some omnibus bill that 4 people wrote in a back room, nobody's seen, spends over $1 trillion in 2,000 pages that's not subject to scrutiny or amendments. It's really an outrageous process that had become pretty common. This year, we're finally back to a more sensible approach where the bills are being considered not individually, but in small groups of 2 or 3 or 4 bills. They're on the floor, they're open to amendment, they're open to scrutiny. And if we keep up at this pace, when we get to the end of the fiscal year on September 30th, the 30th of September will just be another day. There won't be any mystery about keeping the government open because it will have been funded. So, all in all, I think it's been actually remarkably productive. I think the economy is very, very strong in some part due to very constructive pro-growth tax reform that we've done and changing the regulatory environment. I am worried about whether this trade spats or skirmishes devolve into a full-blown trade war. I think that is a cloud on the horizon of what is otherwise a very, very strong economy. And then the last thing, my earlier visit today was over at the Berks, I don't remember the exact name of it, Berks County Family Detention Center, is that it?
Residential Center.
Residential Center. So I wanted to go there in person, see it with my own eyes. There's been a lot of controversy about it. And I'll say I was quite impressed. I was impressed with a number of things. Number one, it doesn't feel like a detention center at all. There's no fence, there's no wall, there's nothing keeping people in. If they wanted to, they could walk away. It's a comfortable environment, a little institutional in nature, but I think that's to be expected. The staff seem to be very conscientious about treating the people there with dignity and making sure that their basic needs are met, including the obvious things like food and shelter and health care. There's education. There are ordinary classrooms that look exactly like any elementary school classroom you would find in Berks County or anywhere else in the state. So for this small population, it is it's pretty modest in scale. It seems as though folks are being treated very well. We did, after all, come to this country illegally. So I was impressed with what I saw. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Are you at all worried about the president shutting down the government? You said September 30th, another day. Some of the president's tweets indicate otherwise.
Yeah, the president has tweeted otherwise, but I think we're going to get on the president's desk a very large majority of the government funding bills, and I think he's actually going to likely to sign them along the way. I don't think he's going to stop in, I don't know, late August and not sign a, I don't know, ledge branch funding bill or Transportation, Housing, Urban Development bill, or one of those, over the dispute about the wall, which is what he has raised as the issue. Now, what will probably wait till last is the bill that funds the Department of Homeland Security. That's the bill over which this fight might well occur. But if everything else passes both Houses of Congress and is signed into law by then we'll have, I think it's less than 10% of the discretionary funding of the government that will be incomplete and subject to an impasse, possibly, if it comes to that. But when the entire mandatory 2/3 of government spending continues automatically, and the remainder is 90% complete, it's not much of a government shutdown that's left, right? I mean, not advocating it, but it's much, much less disruptive than it would be if we hadn't gone through this process.
Your visit today to the detention center, what's next there with that whole issue separating families and children? What did that visit do for you?
Well, it gave me a first-hand understanding of what actually happens with families that are going through this process. And my understanding is that the vast majority of the families there stay for a very short period of time because, again, my understanding is the people who are apprehended either at the border or because they've come in on a flight from somewhere else, big majority are apprehended at the border, they decide to seek asylum. So either they initially seek that, or after meeting with attorneys they decide they're going to seek asylum. And so that puts them on a process that leads quickly to their release, not immediately, and so that's where they stay here at this facility for what averages, I think, a couple of weeks, maybe 3 weeks. And then they're released after they have indicated where they intend to live and with whom. They usually have a family connection somewhere. It's usually not in Pennsylvania. They're going to travel somewhere else. My understanding is, based on that information, an appointment is established with local authorities that adjudicate their asylum claim. And that's what it comes down to. So
what do you think should happen? Do you support continuing to operate it as is? Does it seem like a reasonable establishment?
This does seem like a reasonable way to handle the situation, right? Again, what are the circumstances? This is a family shows up at the border. They come into the country illegally. In some cases, they come through a port of entry that are designated for asylum seekers, so they're not here illegally, actually. But their claim for asylum has to be adjudicated, right? Something like 90-some% of everybody that's apprehended says they're seeking asylum. And we have a very low threshold for granting a person a temporary stay during which that request can be adjudicated. So you have to have some way to process them, some way to get them on the docket in the system, look after them. And so, as I say here, it seems that they're very well looked after, as best that I can determine. And then you have to have an adjudication. Are they, in fact, do they meet the criteria for getting asylum, or do they not? If they don't, then they're going to go back to the country that they came from. If they do, then they're going to stay. Facilities like this, probably. I think this is part of the problem, is we got actually a surge some years ago, but it has continued periodically, of families coming across, especially moms, but not exclusively moms, with minor children. And so that's more complicated and challenging to have a facility that's safe, secure, allows them to be processed, and we move on to the next step in the adjudication of their asylum request.
What about the larger legislative situation with immigration? That seems to be one area that's constantly been a struggle to find something that everybody can agree on. Are you seeing any progress on that?
Honestly, I think it's too late this year to get something done. We're far too close to the election, and it's just not likely. And it is frustrating. We clearly have a number of issues that we need to address. I do think the Senate actually passed legislation. So I hope we'd be able to find a way forward in the next Congress.
So you want to talk about Iran and the sanctions and everything? Today, the Department of Defense is trying, let's see here, they're trying to reduce the reliance of energy. I think I'm mixing my things here. Now, you urged the Department of Defense to lessen dependency on armed forces in Europe on Russian-sourced energy, right?
Right.
Okay. So are you saying that you want to use U.S. Energy source over there?
Sure,
Like,
that would
shoot
be a
that
lot
over
better.
for the
Yeah,
military?
yeah, that'd be a lot better than using Russian-sourced
Yeah.
energy.
I mean,
So that could come in the form of coal. It could come in the form of liquid natural gas. You know, it would be bizarre to me to have U.S. military facilities dependent on Russian energy sources. Russia, the government of Russia has been a malign actor and wreaking much havoc all around the world, including in the United States. They're clearly a major adversary. I don't want our military outposts to be dependent on them for energy.
so to be clear, are they right now? Is that?
Yeah, my understanding is we do have some American military facilities using Russian natural gas. I believe that is the case. Is that your understanding?
Yes, right now we do have some in Europe where they are dependent on exports from Russia.
So regarding immigration, sorry to circle back with, you were saying that maybe we need more facilities like the one in Berks County. One thing the attorneys for the asylum seekers here say is they don't really have a chance to make their case because they're sort of thrown in front of somebody, and they like would you be for, besides more facilities like that, more resources to, you know, legal?
So I've co-sponsored a bill that would, I think, double the number of judges that hear the final adjudication of whether or not a person should be granted asylum. And it would also authorize constructing more family facilities to hold families while they await that adjudication. I'm not aware of the specifics of the case that somehow people are not getting their day in court. Is that what you're?
I think the attorneys who represent them feel like they don't have a chance to talk to somebody who can help them while they're being questioned, that there's a lack of resources on that.
Okay, I mean, the folks that I met with showed me the room where they are given a chance to meet with lawyers. Lawyers explain their rights. This is what they've told me, is many people arrive and they don't make an allegation that they're afraid to go back to their country, which is one of the key criteria for having a valid request for asylum. They then meet with the attorneys and they come out of the meeting and they say that they have a fear of going back to their country. So it certainly suggests that they're getting some legal advice. But I mean, obviously, I'm not in the room. I can't vouch for what actually is happening. But if you do look at the fact pattern, does suggest that people are in fact being released, usually with some kind of monitoring device like an ankle bracelet, at least at first, to ensure that they stay in the system, show up for their appointment. But that appointment is not an adjudication. It actually takes, I'm told, 2 to 5 years from the time a family is released here from the Berks County facility to the time that they would get a final adjudication. Now, my understanding is that most of these adjudications ultimately result in a denial of the asylum request. And I think that's because we have pretty stringent criteria for what actually constitutes a legitimate asylum. Pretty low bar for having your day in court, but a pretty high bar for convincing the judge that you in fact should be granted asylum. I think it's about a legitimate, justified fear of a personal persecution based on your religion or your politics or some other factor that we don't think should cause you to be persecuted. In fact, quite a lot of these people are coming because the country's a mess that they live in, right? There's some level of chaos, maybe even anarchy, there's terrible crime, the economy's a disaster, the country's in terrible shape, but that's not, under our law, that's not criteria for asylum. So that's what I think the system is meant to try to determine.
Would you be for tinkering with that at all? The fact that
broadening the criteria for asylum.
They have very high murder rates in some of these countries.
Yeah, I think that's a discussion we should have, right? I mean, historically, asylum has been meant to be conferred in these narrower cases. I think we have to ask ourselves how many folks can and do we want to absorb. I think it could be a substantial number. I'm in favor of pretty large-scale legal immigration. But let's be honest, there are hundreds of millions of people around the world who live in terrible countries that are badly misgoverned, that are violent, that are economically disastrous, that are corrupt, and have all these problems. If we expanded our criteria for granting asylum to all of those folks, we could pretty quickly have a completely unmanageable number. So that's an important factor we'd have to keep in mind.
I do have one other question. I
No,
want
go
to
ahead,
filibuster here. So, all right. So since these countries are sort of directly to our south, I mean, not hugging us, but close enough, do you think that suggests we should change our foreign policy to get those countries better so we don't have this?
I think we should absolutely be engaged in the region with efforts to try to bring stability and ultimately prosperity to these countries. Yeah, absolutely. It's in our interest as well as their interest. Now the problem is you've got, quasi-failed states to deal with where, where do you start? They have a completely corrupt or dysfunctional government. In many cases, it's hard to work with what you have there. But as a general matter, yes, I think we should be open to trying to help encourage normalcy and prosperity in these countries.
So, Judge Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation, you said that you've been supportive of him. What would you say to Democrats who have opposed him before his name was even out there?
I think that's indefensible, frankly. We have a vacancy. Why you would oppose the person at this moment under these circumstances, sight unseen, without knowing who it is, that's unbelievable to me.
And how about now that they,
well, I mean, maybe this is why they said that then, because they can't find anything wrong with Brett Kavanaugh. I mean, he's a very, very impressive candidate. And, by the way, there's no mystery about what kind of a judge he'll be. He wrote 307 decisions as an appellate court judge. So we have this huge volume of information, and I think it's interesting to note that I see very, very little by the way of specific critiques of his opinions. There's a huge body of information out there. If he were not a good judge, you would think that his opponents would be citing chapter and verse of all the examples of how he has proven that he's not a good judge. Well, in fact, they have no such evidence. He's a very, very thoughtful, very intelligent, very humble, really pleasant guy to meet with. I think he'll be a great justice. I think he's going to do a great job at the hearing. And I don't know what my colleagues are going to give as an excuse for not supporting him.
So we heard today about the shootings in Chicago. I don't know if you heard those
I have
statistics.
not heard this,
That,
no.
just that over the weekend, they had, they've had a lot of shootings
Right.
over the years anyway, but over the weekend, they had a crazy number, like
60, I think.
66.
Oh my
something like
God,
that. And then in a matter of like 2 hours, they had something like, I don't know, a huge number. So there's just been like.
And these weren't like a couple of psychopathic mass shootings.
No,
it was
wasn't
more
like that. It
the
was more of the Chicago shootings you hear about all the time.
crime related.
Correct. They had to shut down like an emergency room or something because they were full with shooting victims. But can you talk a little bit about your view on how to help solve the gun problem in the U.S. and then also we'd be curious to hear what you think about the printable 3D guns, kind of two separate.
Yeah. So on the first, it strikes me, and I haven't seen news reports since the first paper I read early this morning. I've been on the road, so I'm not sure exactly what the details are in Chicago. But pretty clearly, it sounds like an extension and acceleration of a huge problem of criminality. I mean, these are generally, I think, if this is a continuation of the high murder rate that we've had in Chicago for some time, tremendous problems with gangs and fighting over drug turf and the criminality that goes with that, and murdering people from rival gangs and deals that go badly. So I want to be clear, that is of a very, very different nature than these horrendous, sensational stories of the psychopath or the other person who's obviously mentally deranged, who goes off and shoots as many people as he can in some place where people are defenseless. So very, very different sort of circumstances. I've been unusual among Republicans because I have been willing to do something about what I see as a gap in our background check system. We actually have more than one gap. My view, I'm a big Second Amendment supporter. I think the Heller decision was right. It's an individual right. It's independent of a militia, and it's very important to me. Having said that, I also believe what Justice Scalia wrote, which is that the laws that we have that restrict access to firearms on the part of criminals and people who have been adjudicated to be dangerously mentally ill, those are reasonable laws and they're not inconsistent with the Second Amendment. Therefore, it's my view that a 3-minute background check to determine if you are in the category of people that can legally and permissibly and constitutionally be deprived of the Second Amendment because they're a criminal or they're dangerously mentally ill, that background check's a very reasonable and sensible thing. So that's the fact that we don't always do that, and in fact there are many circumstances we don't. Joe Manchin and I got together and we thought, if we could require background checks on all commercial sales at least, and we were thinking specifically about gun shows where many transactions occur on essentially a commercial scale without a background check, also over the internet where this happens as well. We wanted to capture those categories and make them subject to background checks, and I still do. I still think that's the right policy. That is not an infringement on the rights of law-abiding citizens. As you know, we failed. We didn't have the votes. We didn't get to 60 votes. We've actually voted on that twice. And if we had a vote tomorrow, we wouldn't get to 60 again, although honestly, you really have to talk to the people who vote no, right? I'm for it. I wrote the bill with Joe Manchin. I think some are concerned that it's a slippery slope, and I can't explain it because I don't think there's a good explanation for not having. And by the way, in Pennsylvania, we have universal background check on handgun sales. If you want to sell a firearm to your husband, you need to do a background check before that can be completed under Pennsylvania law. And honest to goodness, I've never once had a constituent come to me and say, we have this terrible infringement on our Second Amendment rights with respect to handguns and we need to change this law. Nobody. Not one. So I'm not convinced of the arguments that this is a, an undue burden.
Sometimes, I think one of the concerns is there's no background check with that. You can just go to the internet and print it.
Yeah.
So should there be some kind
So
of...
my understanding is it's already illegal to manufacture a gun that does not contain enough metal to be detected by a conventional metal detector. So if you have a 3D printer that uses plastic, which is the controversial one here, it's already illegal. That's my understanding. So I think manufacturing, selling, distributing those guns is already illegal.
What about putting it on the internet?
So I think technically that gets into a interesting and challenging First Amendment debate, and I'm not a lawyer. I would want to hear the arguments about whether or not putting that out is itself prima facie a violation of the First Amendment. But the manufacturing is a different thing. That's not a First Amendment issue. And as I say, I think it's already illegal.
It's worth noting there is an injunction in some cases for the blueprints being put up there, but in the decision, the judge kind of echoed with the senator, just that there is First Amendment problems with a permanent ban on not allowing them.
Can you speak to the political environment that we're in right now, specifically some of the statements, tweets the president makes that cause a lot of stir, a lot of discussion? I mean, where do you fit into this whole thing? There are people who say that it's up to Republicans to denounce him when he says something outrageous, which he does from time to time. You're representing a state that's pretty evenly divided, and I imagine you do push back against the president in some cases, the tariffs notably that we discussed before. I'm imagining that you get pushback from some Republicans here because of it. I mean, and you've got other people on the other side who want you to oppose everything he says and does. I mean, how do you manage all that in this environment, especially in a state like this?
Yeah, well, it's a good question, and this is I've never found myself in this position before, shall we say. I guess the way I think about it is, first of all, it is not in my understanding of my job description to be the editor of the president's tweet feed. So the president can say a lot of things that I'm going to disagree with. I don't necessarily feel an obligation to comment on it one way or the other. There are times when he crosses the line I feel it is necessary to make a statement. I think he made statements at the time of the Charlottesville demonstration were too objectionable not to respond. So I have at times weighed in. But as a general matter, what I try to do is let's focus on actions rather than words. Let's focus on policies. Let's focus on things that really matter to the people that I represent. When I think the president is right, I'm happy to work with him, and tax reform is a good example. The administration worked closely with me and my colleagues on the Senate Finance Committee who were drafting this bill. It was a very lengthy, very time-consuming, labor-intensive process of a lot of iteration and endless back and forth with mostly the Treasury Secretary and Gary Cohn, who was in the White House at the time, occasionally the president. And it led to a terrific outcome, I think. I'm happy to engage, and it's my job to engage with the president when that kind of opportunity comes along. On the other hand, when the president does things, for instance in the trade space, that I think are harmful to Pennsylvania and to the country, and he's actually taking action, then I feel like it's important to be pushing back. So I have very different criteria depending on whether the president is actually doing things or whether he is putting out tweets that I might not agree with.
Excuse me, just want to note we have about 10 minutes remaining.
So on tax reform,
Yeah.
Do you think it is essential policy or politics-wise to make the middle-class tax cuts permanent before November 6th, let's say?
Oh, we're not going to be able to do it before November 6th. Our Democrat colleagues won't agree to do it in any way that would be that wouldn't also do harm in other areas. So I don't see that happening before November 6th. It'd be great. I mean, I'm in favor of making the whole thing permanent. It should be permanent. The changes we made are constructive changes. I agree with virtually all of them. There's a few things plenty of things I'd do differently if I were the only guy writing the bill. But we ended up with a very good product, and for a variety of reasons, including just the certainty of how people will be affected, it'd be good to make it all permanent. I don't think we have the votes in the Senate. The House could, but we can't do it in the Senate.
Do you think it wouldn't increase the deficit to make them permanent?
No, I don't think so. I think the growth that we get, I mean, if you look at how strongly the economy has surged, I think that is significantly in response. Now, I will acknowledge that I think most of the growth comes from what we did on the business side of the tax code, but I wouldn't be in favor of raising taxes on the individual side. I'd like to make them permanent. And I think that the growth is likely to be sustained, in which case we will end up bringing in more revenue under this reform tax code than we were going to bring in under the old code. And if we've done that, then it's just a complete winner all the way around.
You've been interested in the opiate epidemic too,
Yes,
right?
very much so.
You've done quite a bit of work on that?
Quite a lot.
Talk about that a little bit.
It's horrendous. When I first was sworn in January 2011, and I started going around meeting with folks all around the state, I was, frankly, back then, I was surprised at how urgent the problem was then. And of course, it's gotten much worse since then. So I've tried to dig into this in a variety of ways and pass various bills. I have a number of bills that have been passed and signed into law that are sort of rifle shots on this. I've tried to expose what I think is a very, very fundamental driver of this. And this is a little controversial, but I will tell you, I think we wildly overprescribe opioids in this country. We reached a peak, I think, 2 years ago. I think the data shows that the total volume of opioid prescriptions has declined for the last couple of years. But even this lower level, as of last year, or might have been the year before, the most recent year for which we had data, the total volume of opioid prescriptions in America was 5 times what it was in 1992. 5 times. It's crazy. We have counties in Pennsylvania where the number of opioid prescriptions written in a year exceeds the number of men, women, and children living in the county. How can that possibly make sense?
Where are you getting that from?
Where's the data coming from?
Yeah.
Various sources, but they're reliable. I can get you all the backup you like on the specific data. I don't remember the source of that particular fact, but I'm quite confident of the reliability of the data. And of course, the other fact is that we prescribe vastly more opioids than any other country in the world, including wealthy countries that can afford it. They just choose not to. So, frankly, I think that's in the culture of medicine. There was a cultural change where the risk of addiction was either downplayed or misunderstood, and an obligation to eliminate pain was emphasized. And so doctors were under pressure to write a lot of prescriptions, and they did. Now there's a greater awareness. There's encouraging news like the folks at Geisinger told me that system-wide their volume of prescriptions written is down 50%, 50, from its recent high. That's great news. It tells you that something was really out of whack when they could cut it in half. Frankly, I think the optimal level is probably way below. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a scientist, but I think it's common sense that we've got to get a lot lower. That's just one aspect. We've got CMS manages Medicare and Medicaid. Between the two of them, the federal government is the biggest buyer of opioids in the world by far. There's nobody else close. The opioid prescriptions that are written through Medicare and Medicaid are massive. And we have badly flawed systems for dealing with that. For instance, Medicare has this little program for monitoring. It's meant to monitor people who are at high risk to opioid, or to qualify for this monitoring, is like multiples of what the CDC believes is a dangerously high level. So we've got too few people in that system. If you have overdosed on opioids but you survive the overdose, you're not automatically put in the system. You can have a doctor prescribe opioids for you, a couple of weeks later, and Medicare will just pay the bill. Medicare has the data. Medicare knows exactly what everybody's consuming. It is a logical place to put some controls, so that at least we're monitoring and watching this. I did get a bill signed into law that allows for limiting availability for people who are getting multiple prescriptions for opioids at the same time, filling them at multiple pharmacies and getting them, by the way, from multiple doctors. Now, in some cases, that can be an innocent case where a person has multiple maladies. They go to a few different doctors. Each one prescribes an opioid without knowing what the others are. But this is one of the reasons I'm supporting requiring electronic prescriptions for opioids. We have electronic prescription mandate for everything else, but not for opioids. We still use handwritten scripts, and without complete medical record access, we're going to have doctors prescribing opioids that don't know that another doctor prescribed it last week. We've got to make sure that a doctor can go to a person's records and know exactly, oh, Mrs. Smith just got a prescription for a 21-day supply of this powerful opioid. I'm not going to give her another prescription for an equivalent thing.
So you're saying you want to make prescriptions electronic?
Yes, electronic. I want Medicare to do a better job monitoring the usage, even when it is electronic. And that's not the whole problem, but I think one of the data points that was very compelling to me is this is not a uniformly national problem. It is very much a regional problem. It's a huge problem in Appalachia, from Arkansas up to New England, along the Appalachian regions. And there are some pockets where it's also other places where it's a huge problem. But you take the upper Midwest, for instance, it's not a problem. There's actually very, very low frequency of opioid overdose. And there's a tremendous correlation between the volume of prescriptions being written per person and the number of opioid overdose deaths. It's an amazing correlation. You can't ignore it. So I think we've also got to deal with how we change the culture of medicine.
So since we're short on time, does anybody have questions that they want to bring up?
I have one follow-up. Since you said opposing Brett Kavanaugh before his name was out was indefensible, did you talk to Senator Casey about that?
I have not spoken with Senator Casey about that. You'd have to ask him.
What do you guys talk about?
Well, I will tell you. One of the things we do talk about is judges at other levels of the federal judiciary, and he and I work together. We have an arrangement, an understanding. We had it. It included the Obama administration. It now includes the Trump administration, and it's a process by which we recommend people to the district courts, and the White House then nominates the people we recommend, and we work together to get them confirmed. In my first 6 years, and I think it continued into my 7th year, which was last year in the Senate, Senator Casey and I have had more district court judges nominated and confirmed than any other state, with the exceptions of California and New York, much bigger states with far more vacancies. And we're #1 without qualifiers among states that have a bipartisan Senate delegation. So we work hard at it. We've got some wonderful people who agree to serve as vetting panelists in each of the 3 districts of Pennsylvania, and it's been remarkably successful.
That's awesome. should have about 1,000 more questions for you, but respect
Well,
your time.
thanks for having me. I appreciate your taking the time.
Thanks for stopping by.
Sure.